And it's my very great pleasure to announce that this year the oration will be delivered by Professor Simon Finfer. For those of you that don't know Simon, he's a professorial fellow in the Critical Care and Trauma Division at the George Institute and an adjunct professor at the University of Sydney Medical School. He's a practicing critical care physician with an appointment as Senior Staff Specialist at the North Shore and is Director of Intensive Care at the Sydney Adventist Hospital. He's a council member of the International Sepsis Forum and the Global Sepsis Alliance and a member of the World Sepsis Day Steering Committee. His postgraduate qualifications include Fellowship of the Royal College of Physicians, the Royal College of Anaesthetists and also the College of Intensive Care Medicine. Simon was the chair of the Clinical Trials Group from 2000 to 2004, and he was integral to a number of very major studies, including Nice Sugar and obviously the landmark SAFE trial, which really, I think, put the CTG on the world stage. During his time as chair of the CTG, delivered the idea of the NUSA-based Clinical Trials Group meeting, and again, the CTG NUSA meeting has now become the mainstay of the development and design of future CTG trials. The Society elected him to the ANZICS Honour Roll in 2011, and now without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Simon. Thank you, Simon.
Thanks, Andrew. You're all a long way away, but it's an honour to be asked to do this. I'm very much a practicing intensive care physician because I'm actually on clinical service this week, and I did ward rounds this morning, and then I'd like to thank Anthony Delaney for covering for me while I fly down to Melbourne, give this talk, and then go back to be on call again this evening and for the weekend. So that's what intensive care practice is about, and it's unrelated to the fact that my mother-in-law arrived from England last night. I'm probably pressing. So, oh, look, nothing's happening. Can I have my slides? Do I have to do something? I'm inept. Okay, so you get a bit worried when people ask you to give the ANZICS Oration. Because you think, well, they obviously think I'm a bit past it now. This is the end of the road. But hopefully it's not. I wasn't given any kind of idea about what I should talk about. I was told to talk about something that interests me. And so you won't be surprised to hear that I'm going to talk about critical care research. I'm going to talk a bit about our successes, because those of us who were there from the beginning probably at some point need to sit down and write this down, because I think a lot of people don't know quite how it all happened. I'm going to talk about some challenges and what I see as our responsibilities as individual clinicians and also as a society. Now, I've got this, I was talked into having one of these Twitter account things, which is very interesting. And one of the things I've discovered on Twitter is there's a lot of people out there talking. It's like this parallel universe that I didn't know existed. And it's very hard to find out whether the people, you've actually got to dig and dig and dig to find out, A, if they know what they're talking about, and B, particularly whether they have any conflicts of interest. So I haven't put up a conflict of interest statement, but if you want to find it, go to my Twitter account, because I think I'm one of the few people who's actually put it on there. So am I qualified to talk about research? Well, I think I probably am. I've played most roles in research, and a lot of what I'm going to talk about now comes from that, both from the clinical trials group, from involvement with industry research, and some of the writing and publication stuff. But I thought I'd start with a historical context. And it's interesting that a lot of this happened in the sort of early to mid-90s. The first critical care trials group was the Canadian group, which was formed in 89. And then we formed in 94 at a meeting fairly informally, I have to say, at the ASM in Sydney. And interestingly, that was the same year that the ARDS network was formed. The early days of the CTG, I think we have to say, were a little bit unstructured. And it was 20 years ago, so I think I qualified as having youth then, as did the other sort of leading members. We had a lot of enthusiasm. We were completely inexperienced. We actually had no idea how to run trials. When we look back now, we can see just how inept we were. We didn't have a structure at all, and we didn't have a plan. But we thought we could get by with youth enthusiasm, and the inexperience, etc., would take care of itself. And I think we were lucky. The first bit of luck was that I was involved in doing some research with Deborah Cook, and I went to a Canadian Critical Trials Group meeting. And for the younger people in the audience, this is a real trap. You go to meetings and you come bounding out with enthusiasm and you say, I know how to do this, and you end up doing it for the next 15 years. But the lessons that I came away from there, that the Canadian group meeting, was obviously, it's so blindingly obvious that we can't really understand why we thought we could do without it, was we actually ought to have a structure. So that was the first time that we sat down, had a discussion, and I put this proposal forward that we would have a sort of formal structure, and the ANZICS board made the executive a subcommittee of the board. And it's largely how it is now. And the other thing that was critical, and as Andrew referred to, was that up till then, we'd kind of tried to meet in conjunction with something else. And the Canadians meet at Lake Louise every year, and they play in the snow. And we thought we'd meet at Noosa every year. We did actually, every year people would say, well, can we go somewhere else next year? And we went to Surfers for 1 year. But otherwise, we've just been at Noosa the whole time. And it works very well. And obviously now there are other meetings, there's the Winter Forum, etc. And those things that are not very exciting, but they were critical to our development, and they were something that we maybe would not have happened if I hadn't looked at the model of the Canadians, who were at that time probably the most successful group. The other great bit of luck we had was that the ANZIC Foundation was being revamped by David Tuxon. And he saw the CTG and the foundation working together. And as a result of those discussions, we came up with this research plan. And our research strategy was that we thought we would get baseline data together, do epidemiological and outcome studies, which we thought we could do fairly quickly. And these were all done totally unfunded. And then we optimistically thought we could do randomized controlled trials of interventions, then establish and disseminate guidelines, and then go back and reassess the epidemiology and the outcome. Now, my original versions of this slide had a timescale on it of 5 years, which was obviously ridiculously optimistic. And I don't think we actually have followed this through. We've done randomized controlled trials, but our intention to follow this around has never happened. But nevertheless, we identified these priority areas of research, and this led to these papers of epidemiological research. Andrew Burston led the study of acute lung injury and ARDS, which showed us what the incidence was, and also that whilst we all thought we were low tidal volume, high PEEP ventilators, we were actually high tidal volume, low PEEP ventilators. As usual, when you study your practice, you find it's not quite what you thought it was. I led the sepsis study, and John Myberg led the traumatic brain injury study. And those studies were critical in giving us the data we needed for when the next bit of luck came along. Because the next bit of luck we had was that the Cochrane Injuries Group decided to write their famous meta-analysis on albumin, saying that albumin killed people. And this got a lot of press in the UK. And here in Australia, at least, where albumin at that time was supplied free to the hospitals, and we did a quick sort of survey and found it was being given to 50% of people in ICU. We were very easily able to make a case that it was important that we found out whether this was true or not. The response of the government at the time was to send all doctors a letter to say, be aware of this study and use albumin with caution, which we thought was unhelpful and that would be better if we did a study. So we thought we'd do this study, and we worked out, and we had a lot of meetings in Melbourne, and we worked out we needed to do a 7,000 patient study. And everybody we went to and said, we want to do this 7,000 patient study, said, don't be ridiculous. It can't be done. It's not possible. Nobody's ever done it. And we started asking people around the world, can we do a 7,000 patient study? And I emailed Richard Peto in Oxford, which is where I'd come from, and he said, oh, there's this guy called Stephen McMahon who's just set up a research institute somewhere in Australia. You should talk to him. And Stephen McMahon had actually set up what was then the Institute for International Health at Royal North Shore Hospital. So he was in my hospital. He just arrived. I'd never heard of him. And I sort of found out where he was. He was over the car park in this group of offices. And he had a staff of 6 at the time. And I went and knocked on his door and said, oh, I'm Simon Finfer, I work over in the intensive care unit, and can I talk to you about a study? And he said, sure. What? And I sat down and I told him a bit about Cochrane and blah, blah, blah. And I said, so we want to do a 7,000 patient blinded randomized controlled trial of one fluid against another. And his response was, how can I help? Not, you're mad. And I came out of this office thinking, I like this guy. I think I can work with him. And of course now Stephen and Robin run the George Institute for Global Health, which has offices in Sydney, India, China, Oxford University, and a staff of many hundreds, and is one of the top 10 most influential research institutes in the world by impact. So we were very lucky because he was in the car park. He just arrived. He was quite looking forward he wanted to develop some projects, and this guy came. And in fact, he said afterwards, he said to me, the one thing that I was worried about was that we'd set up this study and you guys would all walk away and leave me to run it. And of course, that was never going to happen. So that was another huge piece of luck. And then we had the great luck, I think, that CSL was a recently privatized company. And so they still had what I would call a public service culture. I'm not saying they don't have that now, because I don't interact with them now the way I did back then. But I know for sure then they did. Because when the things that we went through to get this study done, when I think back about it, I don't understand why it happened. Because we had to blind the fluids. And in order to blind the fluids, we had to put saline in bottles. Now, the only people who make saline in Australia were Baxter. So we went to Baxter, and they were quite happy to collaborate with us, but they said, well, we could put it in bottles, but they're actually different bottles from CSL's bottles, so it won't really be blinded. So we said, well, can't we bring their bottles to you? And they said, they don't fit on our production line. And I said, well, can we truck your saline to CSL? And they said, we can't do that. We have to maintain the quality of the production the whole way through. And so CSL eventually said, oh, look, we'll just become a manufacturer of saline. And they had to shut down their production line for albumin periodically to make saline for the SAFE study. Now, surprisingly, you can't just put stuff into bottles and pour it into people. There are 1 or 2 regulations along the way. And the first batch of albumin and saline bottles that came off the production line had a shelf life of 3 months because they'd only done stability testing for 3 months. So this whole process was extraordinary. And I think to try and do that now, I'm not sure we could do it. But we did it then, and it was done through a lot of collaboration, which we should all be very proud of. So it was another bit of luck, because I don't think, historically we could probably get that done now. And we all know what happened. We did the study. It was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. John Marshall and Paul Hebert was sitting in the audience when I presented it, and they came up to me afterwards and they said, "It's a great study. You do realise what its major impact is?" And I said, "Well, I think I know what the data says." And they said, "Oh, that's not the impact. The impact will be nothing to do with albumin and saline. The impact is showing that this can be done. And you have changed," and by you, they didn't mean me, they meant us. We had changed the research paradigm for critical care forever. That you could now do, you could seriously think about doing these sorts of studies. And to do it once was great. And I survived, and my marriage survived. My wife's a very nice English lady. And one Saturday night, when we were about to go out to dinner, someone rang me about a problem with the SAFE study. And I had to delay our departure while I sorted it out, because it was quite a serious problem. And she said, when I came off the phone, she said, "Was that study again?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "I hate that fucking study." So I think it was the first time I'd ever heard her say fucking. So it's not without its, potential costs doing this sort of thing. And having done it once, we did discuss it, and I said to people, "Look, we got to do another study. We got to actually show that this is not just a flash in the pan." So we decided to do nice sugar, which of course was much harder at the bedside. And in this case, my wife didn't say she hated that effing study, but I did used to get in the lifts at Royal North Shore Hospital and hear the nurses, a couple of ICU nurses in front of me one day, and one said to the other, "How's your day going?" And the other one said, "Oh, I've got a bloody nice sugar patient in the lower range." It's a nightmare. I don't know which idiot designed that study. So I put my hand up. I said it was me, actually. Anyway, this is a slide from John Marshall that he showed in Brussels last year. And this is citations per year since publication for critical care research. And you can see Vandenberg #1 and the Nice Sugar study is 2. And if you go on Google Scholar, which I checked yesterday, this study has been cited over 2,700 times. So again, what we have done has not only changed the research paradigm, but has done great things. Clearly, this is one of the Intensive Care Foundation slides. Australia and New Zealand have randomised more patients in critical care trials on a population basis or any other basis than any other country in the world. And the publication record is now something that we can be very proud of, with more intensive care publications in the major general medical journals than any other country in the world. So I think that historically this was a combination of luck, hard work, and we should recognise that there are structural advantages in Australian and New Zealand intensive care that allowed this to happen. And a lot of these things, most of us are in full-time intensive care practice. That is different from the rest of the world, where you have critical care pulmonologists, and in the UK a lot of people were anaesthetists who dabbled. It's changed there, and the same in Europe. Most of us, I know there's going to be some discussion at the AGM about current sort of employment prospects, etc., which are a bit worrying. We had in ANZICS an incredibly cohesive society. It's not like SCCM, which is divided up into little bits, and we're a very cohesive society, relatively small society certainly, but a very cohesive professional society. And George Skoronsky, who is also, I think, still here, just down there, was in charge of the ANZICS Fees Committee, or whatever it was then called. And they negotiated, and I don't know that, again, this was an ANZICS initiative, that they got this schedule of fees, they got intensive care into the schedule of fees, that most people practicing intensive care had sufficient remuneration that they didn't have to be off moonlighting doing something else. And that gives you the freedom to do what you want to do. Again, that is not the case in many places in the world. I was in Brazil, and I've been to Brazil a couple of times now. Fantastic people, fantastic country. They have got something like I think it's in excess of 7,000 or 8,000 intensivists in Brazil, but most of them are working 3 or 4 jobs and moonlighting because they actually get paid very, very poorly. And that makes, they're developing a fantastic research program, but the reality is that if you're not full-time and you're having to moonlight doing something else, you're not going to be doing quality research. So obviously that's the good news and everything's going fantastically well. We can all relax. Well, maybe not, because I want to talk about some of the challenges. So the reason we do clinical research is to understand things for sure, but I think the predominant reason we do research is either to reinforce behaviour, to show people that what we're doing is right, or to change behaviour. So Arise, for instance, I think reinforces our current belief that we shouldn't all suddenly rush off and do early goal-directed therapy. And the bottom line of this is to improve patients' outcomes. And that is a substantial responsibility. If you want to influence other people's clinical practice, hopefully for the better, we should recognise that as a huge responsibility and not something to be taken lightly, which is why I find the whole kind of Twitter sphere interesting, in that there are people offering advice left, right and centre without necessarily anything good behind it. And there's a difference between clinical researchers and pharma, for instance. We have very limited budgets. All our studies are underfunded, very limited budgets. We don't have a sales force. You know, we don't have a whole lot of people going into doctors' offices doing academic detailing to try and get them to do what we have shown is good. So therefore, we need to produce unequivocal, impeachable evidence in order to change practice. And I think we've seen that happen with our studies. And not everybody is on our team. I'm not very keen on this idea that we have to tell everyone they've got to come and join Team Australia, but there are forces working against us, and I wanted to talk about this. There are some very prominent people in the world who like to rubbish or talk down what we're doing and clinical research and randomized controlled trials, saying that they're all negative. Well, I don't believe there's any such thing as a negative trial. I've never been involved in a trial that I didn't learn something from. I don't think that this is a term we should consign to the dustbin. But there are other people who continually point out, well, trials aren't producing positive outcomes and proving things work better, or maybe they don't work better, is a possibility. And I get sent a lot of stuff to review that relates to clinical research in critical care, and a couple of recent reviews I had. One that was sent to me by quite a prominent journal. They were considering publishing a review. The basic hypothesis or proposal they were putting forward was that they'd reviewed all the critical care trials and they had analysed outcomes and they had analysed the outcome measures they used and whether they were a positive trial or not. And they had concluded that in order to improve the success of clinical trials, we should stop using mortal outcomes. We shouldn't use mortality as an outcome because those trials were very rarely positive. We should use other things because they more often produced positive trials. All those outcome measures are largely fraught with difficulty, often invalid, often wrongly measured. And, you know, to say, well, we can improve the success of our trials by measuring something that's invalid, it seems to me, as you can guess, I didn't give this paper a very good review. And the other suggestion was that we could increase the number of positive trials if we just moved the goalposts, the p-value. We would now accept less than 0.1 as showing that something worked. And this was a serious proposition in a paper going to a relatively serious journal. And I reviewed another paper at the same time in the last month that was basically arguing similar things and saying that what we could do much smaller trials and the observational data will suffice. But if you want to produce the sort of data that will change people's minds, I think this is a great paper by, again, Stephen McMahon with Rory Collins from Oxford. It's part of two that I often show in talks because I think they're great papers. Lancet, 13 years ago, but still very well worth reading. You have to control bias and random error. So you need randomization, you need appropriate analysis, and you need large numbers of your primary outcome. And to illustrate how observational data can be totally misleading, this is from the SOAP study led by Jean-Louis, and they looked at albumin, and this was published in 2005, a year after the SAFE study was published. And they concluded from multivariate analysis and propensity matching that there was an absolute increase in hospital mortality of nearly 14% with albumin. So I generally, I'm very dismissive. I think observational data has a role to play, but there are people strongly around the world promoting this as how we should do things. There are other things that people are suggesting that I have, and people I respect, like Derek Angus, for instance, who is very keen that we should embrace adaptive trial designs. And this has been a huge literature in terms of sepsis. And adaptive trial designs are becoming very fashionable. It allows you to probably use less, have smaller sample sizes, etc. I don't understand how it deals with random error. So you're allowed to kind of change things as you go along. You can have frequent looks at the data. You can use data-driven modifications of the trial. And I think this has a role, but I think it has a role in the development of new pharmaceutical agents where a company wants to throw things out rather than spend 50, 500, or even a billion, 500 million or even $1 billion running a trial for something that's not going to work. I don't think it has a role in clinical research. And my problem also with this is I think I like to do trials that have mortality as an outcome based, and the statistical test is chi-squared. Because I think people understand that. And I think the more your statistical analysis is a black box that people just cannot understand, you're asking people to take things on trust. And as I'll talk in a minute, we can't always trust everything that we're told. So what about working with industry? I've already talked about our work with CSL, which was phenomenal. It was fantastic. They couldn't have been a better partner. I suspect these data were discussed yesterday, probably during my afternoon ward round, or maybe during my morning ward round, which is this amazing graph of reduction in mortality. Now, we could have a lengthy discussion about what these data mean, because it's interesting that everything, we've apparently reduced the mortality from everything dramatically. I do believe that we have reduced the mortality for patients in intensive care over the 20 plus 30 odd, probably 30 years that I've been doing it. And I think a lot of that is down to industry. And it's unmeasurable or unmeasured small incremental changes in what we do. When people of my age think back to the sorts of ventilators that were available when we started doing critical care, which could basically blow gas in and let it come out again. We didn't have hemodialysis. We didn't have CVVHD. We did peritoneal dialysis when I first started doing intensive care. All these things that companies have developed, and they've never been demonstrated in a trial to improve outcome, but I'm sure they've played a role. So I'm not trying to suggest that industry doesn't have a role. And I was on the steering committee for the Prowess shock study, which basically killed off drofrucogan alpha. And when I was asked to would I be on this steering committee by someone high up in Lilly, I said, my first question was, well, who else is on it? Because I didn't want to be with all the usual suspects. I'm not interested in working with people who have an agenda. And in fact, people like Bengt Gartland, who's an infectious diseases doctor at the Karolinska in Stockholm, he was asked to be on it because he was heavily critical of Lilly and of the drug and had written extensively on why it should not be allowed. So Lilly said to me, we know that if we do the study with all the usual people, no one will believe us. And I thought this was great insight, that these trials, you can work with people, with industry. We designed the trial, we put in all manner of safeguards, and they were happy with that because they knew if they did it their way, it wouldn't work. Others have written extensively. There are many articles, there are many books about the bad side of industry influence, and I'm not going to dwell on that kind of aspect of it. I'm going to talk about how it impacts on the perception and the application of our research. And I'm going to focus on fluid because that's where I've been for a bit, and there is no particular industry involvement in the glucose side of things, although 3 CEOs of biotech companies told me when I presented the nice sugar study that I'd put their companies out of business. And I said, well, it's not my problem. I'm trying to do research to improve patients' outcomes. So this was the reaction of this was a memo that someone leaked to Ian Roberts when they published the Cochrane review about albumin, that the manufacturers had allocated $2.2 million to a campaign to prepare literature reviews supporting the use of albumin, to prepare and disseminate a critique dossier, and to establish a medical advisory panel which would write articles supporting the use of albumin. And this is kind of, I think, is a fairly standard game plan. And whilst we don't have any leaked memos, it does appear that a similar process has followed from the CHEST study, with a large number of papers published in varying journals around the world, heavily critical of the study, heavily critical of its conduct and analysis and etc., and other data suggesting that we got it all wrong. So this may be paranoia, but part of what the albumin industry did as a response to the Cochrane review was they asked people to write articles, and this was a meta-analysis about the use of starch during surgery. And as you can see, it states in the paper that Fresenius Kabi requested that the research be undertaken, but they had no involvement in it at all. And this is the thing, if you read right to the bottom of the paper, and many people do not do this, many people just read the abstract rather than the whole paper, and certainly not to the bottom. If you get to the bottom, you'll find that the authors were grateful to Dr. Edward Burnett for having conducted the literature search, and Christoph Messer of this German agency for marketing and communication for having organised and retrieved the references. So the authors didn't do that. These people did. So you probably can't read this, but this is the English version of the website of the German marketing organization, and they say, who are we? We specialize in generating and utilizing scientific data for marketing purposes, not for improving patients' outcome, but for marketing purposes. So this is the company that's done the data extraction for the meta-analysis that has appeared in a prominent high-ranking journal. And I was interested to find out who Christoph Messer was, what sort of doctor he was. Well, he's not a medical doctor, he's a biologist, which doesn't mean he's not a good doctor or a good intellect, because many of the people I work with in the research sphere are not medically qualified. But interestingly, they run a company, the goal of which is to generate data for marketing purposes. And this is what led to this paper, and I suspect, and the paper, which had a number of errors in it, not including data that should have been included, etc., is published in a high-ranking journal. Does it matter? I think it does matter, because I don't think most people go and look for that. I do, and I have the time to do it, and other people do. These are a couple of the things that have been said to me by companies. The first one has been said to me more than once when I've gone out to people and said, would you be interested in funding this trial? or collaborating on this trial. We are not interested in funding your proposed study because it is not designed to show our product in a favourable light. That's been said to me more than once. Now, you might not think it's possible to design a study to show a product in a favourable light, but trust me, it is. And the other thing that was said to me, and I do wish I had had a tape recorder running at the time, was can we analyse these data in all three ways and then publish the analysis that shows our product is better? But I would love to have had that on tape. And the answer, of course, was no. We can't do that. We have a statistical analysis plan that we're going to follow. And it was followed by the statement, which I'm not sure how it was taken from me, that these people were talking to me because, presumably because I had some sort of integrity in the research community. And you can only lose, I actually said to them, integrity is like virginity, you can only lose it once, and I'm not interested in losing it right now. I'm not quite sure whether that comment was understood on the other side of the table. And the other interesting thing, and this is the company that extracted the data for the meta-analysis, is also involved in rafting. Rafting is lovely rational fluid therapy in Germany, is a registry, again, observational data, co-funded by Fresenius and run by the marketing company, and this is being presented. And what this is being presented in Europe, and what it quite clearly shows is that hydroxyethyl starch is nephroprotective and should be used. And it also comes with a very anti-clinical trials message. Would you prefer to be randomized to a fluid which is given at the discretion of the treating physician who does not know what it is and hopefully knows what to do with it, or by a physician who can choose any fluid who hopefully knows whether it is the right one and what to do with it? So there are some interesting forces working against what I consider to be our responsibility to do good research in the interests of our patients. I don't understand the Crystal study, but it did have a senior employee of a HES study in a 3-person trial advisory board. That is not declared in the paper. You have to go to clinicaltrials.gov and go right down the bottom of the entry there to find it. So my concern is that there are things that are going on in the research world that you have to look very hard for. And anyone who's been to a meeting in Europe will have probably seen Jean-Louis put this slide up and point out how this demonstrates that indeed HES is nephroprotective, because these lower levels of the rifle score are significantly favouring HES. There's much more risk and injury in the saline side of things. And it was put to us when we were preparing this paper that we might like to lump all these categories together. Sorry, pressed the wrong button. That we could lump all these categories together. Instead of separating them out like this, we should just add them all together and say no abnormal rifle score or abnormal rifle score. And then we would have written a paper that showed that indeed starch was good for the kidney. And this is where I think you need to have some understanding about how it's possible to take a data set and say what you want, and that's why you have a statistical analysis plan. Now, we looked at this and said, well, how can this be? How can it be that at lower levels it looks one way, another way it looks the other? And it was quite straightforward, and it's quite clear to me, was because hydroxyethyl starch increases urine output, but increases creatinine. And to me, creatinine is the true marker of renal injury. But if you have these data and you're not unbiased, you have the opportunity to say whatever you like. And so it was clear to us. There's another thing going on that will probably get some press quite soon in a prominent general medical journal, and which I don't feel free to talk about widely just at the moment. And that's this open data movement. Because there is a movement, which I'm sure you're aware of, the all trials movement and the open data movement, that all trials data should be put into the public domain, and then anyone can do whatever they want with it. To me, and this has come from industry not releasing all the information they have in clinical trials. I think this is incredibly naive and incredibly dangerous, because the reason we write statistical analysis plans, etc., is obvious. We want to pre-state how we're going to analyse the data, what subgroups we're going to do, etc., etc. And that gives the validity to what we say. If you just put the data in the public domain and allow anyone to get at it, you won't know if someone's analysed 25 different subgroups and then picked out the ones that look good for whatever their goal is. You also won't know whether people have true conflicts of interest or not, because they're not declared. And this open data movement is currently being used against us, as us being the chest investigators, to do things that we think are inherently wrong. So that's kind of a bit of a down at the end there. But I think we have to realise that the investigator initiative initiated critical care clinical research enterprise has been unbelievably successful. If you had asked me 20 years ago, when we formed the CTG at the ASM in Sydney, whether we would have achieved what we've achieved, I would have said, well, no, I don't really, we were thinking of doing some trials. We had no idea it would be this successful. I hope it doesn't sound self-serving to say I agree with Andrew. I think the trials group, to a large extent, has... Australia and New Zealand were always known to have good clinical practice and good critical care practice. I think the trials group has been a bit the icing on the cake, and people now often talk about the Australian or the ANZICS being able to do this. Why can't we do it? It's been unbelievably successful. But the process should not end, and does not end, with the publication of a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine. We have to go out and defend what we've done. Now, I believe what we've done is incredibly defendable, and it's been done in the right manner. But there are a lot of people out there saying stuff that I find very disturbing. And it's our responsibility to deal with that. And when there are people distorting the scientific record, I think we as the researchers and as a society as a whole have a responsibility to do that. Because I think we have a moral and ethical duty to minimise the harm that will be done to patients by the misuse and the misrepresentation of research data. And having gone to this huge effort to create this fantastic enterprise, it would sadden me greatly if it wasn't for the public good, it was actually used to harm people. So I'm hoping, that's all I have to say, that's quite a lot. I'm hoping it's not quite the end of the road for me yet, but thank you for the opportunity, Andrew.